Welcome, everyone, to this beautiful class today, Holding the Change, with Karen Sumption. This is Brain Northwest programming. We're really grateful to have Karen back with us again, talking about the important topic of grief and ambiguous loss after brain injury. This is a very relatable topic. Karen has rich experience as a certified peer counselor, certified victim advocate, and also a certified health worker, and has done a lot in her current role and prior roles, supporting people in challenging spaces that are filled with grief and change. So she really brings a beautiful presence with her personal lived experience and her professional wisdom. So thank you for being here, Karen.
Thank you so much, Regine. Again, I'm sorry, everybody. I apologize for the fact that I will be off camera. I was not expecting my camera to, give up the ghost, but maybe it's appropriate because we're talking about grief today. Um, I sort of structured this uh, webinar a little bit differently than my previous webinars. Um, I sort of broke this up into three parts, and this is going to be part one, where we're going to talk about kind of naming the loss. And so the way I sort of structured everything is I'm going to go through some slides. Of course, if you've got questions or thoughts and you don't want to lose them, you can throw them in the chat. But I am going to stop and leave a lot more time for discussion. So we've gotten into some great discussions in the past, and I definitely want to leave time for that and see if things come up for you, if there's things that you agree with, or if there's things that don't resonate with you, kind of as I go through some of this first part about naming the loss. If you've seen previous webinars, I did cover some of this in previous ones I've done on ambiguous grief, and that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So again, my name's Karen, um, and as I was saying before we started recording, a lot of my work lately has been around different kinds of grieving and loss. And I wanted to bring that into this arena. So let me just go ahead and get myself a little bit better set up here. All right. So acquired and traumatic brain injuries are life-changing. Now, I've also talked before, and we've all talked, that not every effect is negative or traumatic. There's often a lot of gifts that come post-injury, increased gratitude, reevaluating your values, making time for things that are important to you, but maybe you've let go by the wayside. So not everything is negative, but there can be differences between how you process, how you exist in space, how you move, how you remember things, um, your occupation, your role in your family after your injury. And some of the feelings that, people talk about when they talk about who they were, what they could do, what they were capable of, what they wanted, and what they dreamed of before injury, and then what they feel like they're capable of and want to do and can't, and struggles and challenges post injury. Um, it's mourning and grief. And sometimes when I say that, people go, "Well, I didn't die, right? Like I'm really grateful that I'm here. Like I still, I should be thankful that I survived and all." And folks are really reluctant to talk about their difficult feelings around some of the changes that they notice post-injury as being grief and mourning. And some of it is because recovery is not a straight line, right? Some days are good, some days are harder, and we don't know, right, what's coming down the line. There can be recovery in lots and lots of areas. And contributing to that is when we don't know how a situation can is going to turn out just as humans, that causes a lot of anxiety. And that anxiety about the future, especially when you lived in a space where you really felt like you were on track, can also contribute to the kind of loss that inspires feelings of mourning and grief. And that comes from what is now called ambiguous loss. Sometimes it's hard to validate what we're feeling as grief because we're living through a loss that's unclear, unresolved, and ongoing, as opposed to the kind of grief that you feel when someone passes away or when you move on from one part of your life to another, right? Maybe if you retire, right, you miss who you were when you were working. Those are pretty clear and resolved. The person that you're mourning is no longer with us, right? The job that you had, you're no longer working. That's pretty clear. But with ambiguous loss, that's kind of unclear and unresolved, and you're currently living in, particularly when there are days where things come easier and days where things can be more challenging. Those feelings of grief and loss are rarely acknowledged as being part of that grief experience. And ambiguous loss was named by Pauline Boss. She wrote a book, Coming to Terms with Unresolved Grief in 1999. It's a really great book. It concentrates a lot more on the experiences of folks around somebody who has experienced an ongoing and uncertain change. She talked to a lot of caregivers of, say, people who have dementia. But the truth of the matter is this unresolved and invisible grief that is complicated and uncertain is really present for a lot of survivors of acquired and traumatic brain injury, particularly when that has to do with trying to redefine our sense of self. So this is actually a quote from a researcher that works directly with folks who are survivors of brain injury. Ambiguous loss relates to the fact that a person looks the same but feels like a different person. I had a patient talk about this today who said, I look in the mirror, I look the same to everybody, but I'm a completely different person. Ambiguous loss confuses everybody. It confuses the person with the injury. The person looks in the mirror and says, I should be just as capable of doing my job as an attorney, as a receptionist, as an artist. When I look in the mirror, I see the same person who was there before, but when I go to work, I just can't do the job the same way. So researchers that work with Pauline Boss at the University of Minnesota, they took the work that she did in her 1999 book, and they grouped the kinds of ambiguous loss experienced by brain injury survivors into some buckets. These are not, the end all be all. You may feel some grief around things that don't neatly fit in any of these buckets, But these are the themes that they saw over and over again, which was a loss of you, me, and us. This is a loss of identity and within a family and within relationships. So maybe you were the main breadwinner, or you were the tough disciplinary mom, or you were the star college student, or you were the one that even something like you were the one that always cooked, always planned, invited, cooked, hosted Thanksgiving every year. Loss of security. The loss of financial and emotional security as a result of the instability and upheaval. So maybe you were the breadwinner, and now, after the injury, you have challenges doing your previous role. And maybe now that you can't do your previous role, you're not sure how your family's going to get by. Loss of connectivity, the loss of a sense of partnership. This can be within a romantic couple, but it can also be in other relationships. It can be your feeling of having friends that you socialized with often suddenly start to drift away. Maybe it's because they don't know how to navigate your injury with you. Um, Maybe it's because your relationship was based on an activity that you did together that's not an activity that you can or want to do anymore. And then loss of future. The uncertainty experienced by folks as their former plans, goals, and hopes are changed. So maybe it's very possible that the things that you hoped for and dreamed of, your injury is not going to change that trajectory, but for a lot of people, it does. And the issue with things like ambiguous grief is, unlike a loss when somebody dies. When somebody dies in our culture, we have rituals. We have things that we understand as a culture and as a society that mark somebody's passing away. Folks know what to say to the survivors. We may, it may be awkward, we may not love, right? But we know how to, we all know to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. We know that there's rituals. There's all kinds of rituals, funerals, or other kinds of memorial services. There's a sense of convention and social recognition that comes around certain kinds of loss. But then there's other losses, like the losses that are in this bucket, that we don't, in these four buckets, that we don't have a way to we don't have a way to cope with, name, or acknowledge in our society. So it can feel it can feel weird or embarrassing or um undeserved to be openly grieving for things that are ongoing, for things like an injury, for things like your changing place in a relationship, for your changing place in the workplace, for your changing identity, for your changing hobbies, for your changing physical capabilities. And when we don't have that shared language and that shared sense of ritual to acknowledge grief, you can call it disenfranchised grief. And it's often hidden or dismissed, and not just by others but by ourselves, right? I don't really have a reason I to feel bad. I'm still alive. This no, what I'm feeling isn't grief, it's resentment, or we try to name it something else. And what it actually does is the it intensifies how that grief affects us. So when we don't openly acknowledge grief, when we don't have a means to socially validate that grief, and when we don't have some sort of ritual practice that we can, rely on to help us navigate that grief, that grief still doesn't go away. It doesn't turn into something else just because we feel weird or bad or guilty or we want to call it something else. That doesn't make it something else or make it go away. And the first step for kinds of most folks, if you talk to them and they work in grief counseling, or they work as grief coaches, and their path is to kind of help people figure out a way to navigate and carry that grief. The first thing that is recommended is to name and validate it, right? Is the first thing that we need to do. And I'm asking everybody in this room to do this with me, is to recognize that that grief is an emotional response to a changed life, right? And it is a legitimate source of grief. It's not just, oh, I've got clinical depression, or oh, I've got anxiety, or oh, my injury has changed the cocktail of neurotransmitters that's happening in my brain. Those may all be true. Those may all be true, right? In addition to grief, we can have depression, we can have anxiety. And yes, part of injuring the brain means that there may be um, different ways that our brain has to accommodate neurotransmitters and other ways of passing emotional and sensory information. We can have those in addition and be in grief. So, what I wanted to do was put this up here, right? It is an emotional response. An emotional response to a changed life is a legitimate grieving process. So, where I wanted to open things up is to talk about what's the hardest to explain to other people, or anything else that this may have brought up for you. As I said, whether that's yes, recognition, or no, Karen, you're completely wrong. That's not what it's like at all. I'd like to spend the rest of the time hearing from you. And I just put the what's hardest to explain to others as a prompt, but don't feel like you need to stick to it. So,
I love this. Let me just pause stop the recording so that people can share, um, and we can open that up. So bear with me because I want this to be a safe space for folks. It'll be nice and loud.